Thank you, Professor Cohen. I'm delighted to be here today to tell everyone what TerraFUND for AFR100 means. So my name is Sylvia, and I'm representing my group. I'm very thankful to be here. So before we start, I would like to give a quick thank you to my team, and especially to our managers, Oliver and Katiana, as well as to Mel and Pauline, who's helped me put this slide deck together, and to our faculty advisor, Professor Rosen. So this is an overview of the contents that I'll be walking us through today. I'll begin by explaining what our mandate was from our client. Next, I'll go into the approach we took for our capstone, the results that we found, as well as the conclusion that we have made from our findings. So first up, our mandate. Our client is the World Resources Institute. You will also be hearing me refer to them as WRI. And they are a research, analysis, and advocacy-focused nonprofit organization working in 7 key areas. And for our capstone, we were working with the forest team on land restoration issues in Africa. So land restoration is underfunded in climate finance, and especially true in Africa. In Africa, only 16% of climate finance is directed into projects that are related to land restoration. And this is even though 65% of productive land in the region is affected by degradation due to unsustainable agricultural practices, deforestation, urban development, and other issues. This also has an economic impact, and 3% of the region's GDP is lost annually from nutrient depletion on croplands. So our client, World Resources Institute, is helping to support restoration and combating this problem through an initiative known as AFR100. AFR100 is an African-led initiative across 30 different countries that has committed to putting 100 million hectares of degraded land into restoration around Africa by 2030. And as part of this initiative, WRI has also initiated a grant program called TerraFUND, which provided $15 million in grant funding to 100 different land restoration projects in 2021. And it's also important for me to note over here that that was only the first cohort of funding, and that future rounds of funding through TerraFUND is to be expected. So our capstone is supporting WRI and TerraFUND by establishing a funding baseline for these 100 TerraFUND projects. And what is a funding baseline? We're using this term to refer to the sources and amount of funding that each of these organizations have received in a single baseline year. And for the purposes of our capstone, we are using the baseline year 2020. So we want to understand how this funding is distributed, or how funding is distributed among these 100 restoration projects in the year 2020, which is 1 year before they received TerraFUND funding. And as you can see from the slides, we are doing this because we want to understand what gaps there are in the financing of these organizations. And we want to use this to help WRI make better funding decisions for which organizations they should fund in future TerraFUND cohorts. This is really important because land restoration organizations need to scale up in order to achieve AFR100's ambitious land restoration commitments. And WRI's theory of change for these organizations is that even though land restoration will require high upfront investment, especially in the first few years, but as these organizations mature, they will be able to scale up and make a return on investment later. And in identifying funding gaps, we can understand where is it that investment is needed now, so that we can help to push these organizations further to the right-hand side of this timescale towards an area where they can become financially sustainable and mature and scale. Okay, so our approach. There are 3 key parts of our methodology. The first being our inputs. So in terms of our data sources, we started off working with WRI's existing database on these TerraFUND organizations, and we supplemented it by conducting desktop research to get gender data for these organizations. Because we were trying to build this funding baseline, we also needed to know what their sources of funding were for the year 2020. And we did that by sending out a survey to all 100 organizations. We also supplemented our knowledge with literature review and expert interviews. And because data analysis across 10 people for 100 organizations is a huge task, we also had to use glossaries and a decision tree in order to make decisions about data evaluation before we could proceed with the data analysis. And in doing so, we were able to produce a funding baseline for our client, identify key trends within this baseline, and produce some client recommendations. So our strongest findings from this process broadly answers these three questions. How is funding distributed across the different TerraFUND countries? What are the existing funding sources for land restoration projects in Africa? And also whether women-owned organizations are receiving an equal share of funding resources or not. And it's important for me to note here that because all of these questions relate to funding sources, so this evaluation was done based on the 29 organizations that did respond to our funding survey and not all 100 TerraFUND organizations. So we come to our results. Our first main finding is that the distribution of funding across different countries for land restoration is highly variable. So looking at this map, which shows you how much funding per hectare of land restored across the different countries, we see that in Mali, every hectare of restored land receives about $13,000 in funding compared to $20 in Burundi. And this suggests to us that across different countries, there will be greater funding gaps than others, and therefore different types and different amounts of effort is going to be needed to help bring them closer to their AFR100 land restoration commitments. Our next key finding is that foundations are contributing the most amount of funding to land restoration organizations. So this graph shows us what the annual amount of funding is by funding source. And the yellow bar, which is foundations, you can see that they're providing not only the most amount of funding, but they're also giving out funding to the highest number of organizations, which is indicated by the number above the bar. So this shows us that funding streams are not well diversified and depend heavily on foundations. And this is an important result for us because it proves WRI's theory of change, that given that funding, grant funding from foundations is variable and sometimes inconsistent, these organizations might not be financially sustainable at the moment and will need more time and effort put in before they can scale up and reach financial sustainability. And if anyone else have any questions about what these different types, the other types of funding sources are, I'm happy to take those questions in Q&A. Our last key finding is that women-led organizations are restoring more land with less capital. So if you look at this graph, we'll see that male-owned organizations, which is the brown bar, is receiving twice the amount of annual funding for every hectare of land that they restore compared to female-owned organizations. And this is also telling us that female-owned organizations might be performing more cost-effective type of restoration, that they are able to stretch every dollar of funding they are given over a larger amount of restored land. Our conclusion. So based on these three key findings, we were able to provide some recommendations to our clients. The first recommendation that we have is that more research needs to be conducted into these countries where we have identified a great funding gap to understand how they could be prioritized in order to provide more help in reaching their AFR100 goals. Our second key recommendation is that WRI should continue tracking these organizations' funding sources year on year in order to understand how their funding streams might change from year to year. This would be an important data point for them to prove their theory of change. And if we see a maturation in these organizations in terms of their financing, then we might see a more diversified a bar chart with like more diversified flows of funding and not everything concentrated under foundations. Our last key recommendation is that WRI should shortlist more women-led organizations in future TerraFUND rounds to help support women organizations acquire funding, especially since they are currently underfunded compared to male-owned organizations. And this will also help WRI stretch every funding dollar that they have over more amount of lands restored. So to summarize, we hope that these findings and the gaps that we have identified and the recommendations that we can provide to WRI can help make economic and social impacts of restoration more equitable across Africa. So thank you, and I look forward to any questions.
Do you know why foundations are the biggest funders in your research, and what can be done to diversify the funding sources across the other categories?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Sorry, let me. Hi. So it's difficult. I think what our data is showing us, or the conclusions that we can make about our data, is we can point out key trends, and it would be difficult for us to say exactly why. But what we have found through literature review is that because foundations tend to be less risk averse compared to, let's say, banks or equity investors, so they are more likely to be giving out funding to these land restoration organizations, even if they are not able to, provide proof for how their revenue or how their organization can scale. So that's why we hope that, in the future, if these organizations are more mature, they're able to tap into other forms of funding. For example, an avocado farm could have an off-taker, get an off-taker which will, have an agreement with them to buy all their products once the avocados ripen. So yeah, that's what we have found. In terms of how WRI can help them to scale up, we think that a good way for this to happen would be to provide technical assistance in understanding how more financing streams can be diversified. So there are a couple of organizations working within Africa that actually focus on financial or economic development of women-led organizations. Another finding that we did not show, but that we did find, was that women-led organizations are actually more dependent on foundation funding, which is right now indicated in brown, compared to male-owned organizations. So focusing on maybe trying to diversify the funding streams of women-owned organizations might also be a good way for WRI to help break out of this cycle. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your presentation. That was great. I'm curious if you could elaborate a little bit on how the women-led organizations are stretching their dollars more. So what kinds of practices they're doing that the male-owned organizations aren't doing.
Okay, yeah. So just a reminder, when we say that we feel like they're stretching their dollars more, it's because if you look at this graph the other way, given that they're receiving less money per hectare, that means that for every hectare that they're restoring, they're using less money compared to male-owned organizations. And again, we do not have enough data to be able to really understand why. The next step for us, or for WRI, would be to take this data, or to take this trend that we have identified, and perhaps control for a couple of factors. Look at how many female-owned organizations and male-owned organizations within the same country doing the same type of reforestation work, and see if this trend still holds true across different countries and different land restoration types. Yeah.